All right, so today we are in Matthew chapter 24. I bit off a little more than I could chew on this over the last few weeks, but it's a difficult passage of Scripture. But if we keep a few things in context, context is the most important part of this Scripture. But we can walk through this, and we're going to take verse by verse and figure out what Jesus was prophesying, what he was teaching us about, and what he, mainly was talking to the apostles too. So kind of introduction, we want to talk about, so there's two parts that are kind of divided in Matthew 24, verses 1 through 34, which will deal with the destruction of the temple. And then 34 on into chapter 25 will deal with the destruction of the world. I want to point out, just talk real briefly on verse 34 before we get there. Kind of sets where we see the transition here. So the apostles have asked Jesus, I thought 2 questions, but Jimmy told me 3 this morning. So we're going to talk about the 2 questions, but there may be a third one if you want to think about that. So the questions from the apostles, we can see in verse, we'll kind of come back, but I kind of want to set this up. In verse 2, verse 3. And he sat on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us when these things will be." So there's question number 1. "And what will be the signs of the coming and the close of the age?" So we're kind of, today, I've kind of studied mostly on the close of the age and, what the signs will be. So verse 34, real quick before we get into verse 1, says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will pass away until all these things take place." So Jesus says that all of these things that he has discussed before verse 34 were going to take place in the lifetime or the generation of those living who he is talking to. This is, if we don't get anything from this class, then I've also learned is the huge piece of this is that to remember that context. Anything before verse 34 down to verse 34 is going to affect the generation of Jews living in Jerusalem and during that time. So that piece of information will keep us from running off into someday that what hasn't happened yet. And we need to remember that these things happened before verse 34 to the apostles, and we'll find out what those things and those signs are. Any comments, any questions? All right, so we'll start in verse 1. So Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. And he answered them, "You will see these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." So when we open in chapter 24, we're, again, context is what we're dealing with. And so chapter 23 finished, and Jesus had just finished all the woe statements condemning the Pharisees. And he has made 2 key statements at the end of chapter 23. The first is, the house of the Jews will be left desolate when they filled up the measure of their fathers. And the second is, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So the end of chapter 23, Jesus is crying, over the city of Israel because of its wickedness. And he tells the Jews, but the temple will soon be left desolate. So desolate means it's deserted of people and in a state of bleak and dismal emptiness. So at this time, you can kind of think of the apostles. They're walking through this magnificent holy city, and Jesus is telling them it's going to be destroyed one day. It's not going to be here. And that's, kind of similar to our country. You go to Washington, D.C., you go to some of our large army bases. Like, we think there's no way, how could something like this ever be destroyed? That's kind of what's on the mind of the apostles. They just can't, they have a hard time, thinking that all the rocks of the temple, will be overturned. Let me get back to my notes here, sorry. So Jesus is departing the temple area, and his disciples are making a point to draw their attention to the splendor of the temple. Jesus' proclamation of the temple desolation was a bold claim considering how great the temple was in the first century. But Jesus will go even further in verse 2 with the announcement that a day was coming when the temple would be destroyed. The destruction would be so complete, not even 2 stones would stand on each other. All right, so moving on to verse 3. Tony, you mind to read that real quick while I get a drink?
Just 3?
Yeah.
Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?"
All right, thank you. So if the temple was the center of the religious life, as it was for the Jews, Jesus' prediction would have been shocking. Naturally, the apostles are curious about Jesus' words at the end of chapter 23 and the beginning of chapter 24. They ask when these things will take place. So their specific question is, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Luke records their question as, "Teacher, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place?" Mark records it as, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are to be accomplished?" Dave, you have something? No. It seems to me that these questions not only refers to Jesus' comment in 24:2, but also in chapter 23, verses 38 through 39. So they've asked about the destruction and the desolation of the temple and about the day of judgment. So what is meant, does anybody have any idea what is meant by the end of the age? What would this mean to the apostles?
So when Jesus was teaching, we find several times, especially if you go to like Matthew 13, we see several times where Jesus talks about the destruction, the end of this world. He talks about how the sheaves will be gathered to the barn, but those wheat will be, destroyed. And he talks about the end of destruction. So this isn't anything new to his disciples. They've been hearing him preach throughout his ministry about the end of time, the destruction of the world. And so I think when we come to this passage, they're remembering a lot of those teachings that Jesus taught about that. And maybe they were correlating the destruction of the temple with the end of time. And that's why I think Jesus clarifies that by going through, the first 34 verses.
Right.
Talking about, the destruction of the temple and when that will be versus when the end of time.
And time will be. Yep, exactly. Yep. So I got Matthew 13, verse 40. So just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. Matthew 13, 49. so it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous. And then verse 40 in the context of the parable of the weeds and of the wheat. All right, so we're dealing with context here. So both of these usages refer to the end of time, which would be Judgment Day. It is possible they believe these two things would happen on the same day. That the temple wouldn't be destroyed until the end of time. That's the apostles, but that wasn't the case as we see as we progress through this chapter. It's going to be there's two different parts of time. So verses 4 and 5. And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray." So during this time, Christ's predictions and the fulfillment of his word, that there would be many false Christs. People would come claiming that the Messiah, that they were the Messiah, and preaching messages contrary to what Jesus has taught them. So Jesus was warning them so they would not be deceived. There's a lot of imposters that are written about in the book of Acts, and then we can see in history books like Josephus's writings. There were a lot of people that would come and try to say that they were either Christ or they were from Christ. So all right, so let's move on. Any comments there? I'm going to move on to verse 6.
Cole,
Yes.
we just need to keep in context that he's answering the first question first. When will these things be? And then in verse 29, he answers that the sign, what will be the sign of his appearing? And then after verse 34, he talks about the end of the ages.
Right.
So we just need to keep this in context when it's talking about, because you hear people, as you go down these verses, when it talks about wars and rumors,
right,
you hear people say, well, the Bible says there's going to be wars and rumors, but that was something that was going to happen
right
on the fall of Jerusalem.
Yep.
Certainly there's going to be war. I don't know that there's a time in the world when there's ever been complete peace.
Right. That's what I'm kind of get to next. And my next is we all have those. So verse 6, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. So I don't know if any of you have religious friends. I have one in particular that anytime any little thing happens in the world, here comes the end of time. And that's not, Jesus says we're going to see coronavirus, stuff like that in the world is always going to take place. So in verse 7, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. So Jesus makes the apostles aware that wars and natural disasters would come, but they were not the signs of the immediate end. So we see in Acts 11, verse 28, a great famine goes across during the reign of Caesar, Claudius. That's also recorded in history. Numerous wars, skirmishes, rebellions occurred in the land of the Jews and abroad within the borders of the Roman Empire. There were earthquakes that hit Pompeii in 62 AD. So all these things, there's always been things before AD 70 that could be signs. But there's not, we're just to be ready for those. We know, and the apostles should have been prepared. So verse 9, they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. So the apostles, as we have seen all through the New Testament, would face significant persecution to advance the gospel. Tradition tells us that all the apostles, except John, were martyred. All these people were killed for spreading the word of God. Verses 10 through 13. And many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead them astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the only one who endures to the end will be saved. So during this persecution, many would abandon Christ and fall away. Not only would they abandon Christ for themselves, they would betray those they had once loved as brothers and sisters, even to the point of hating them. So, we have an example here. We are not even close to being persecuted as the Jews were here. But the Jews that remain faithful, we can learn a lot of lessons in life from them. That we need to put our faith and trust in God, and do what the word says, even under strenuous situations. So false teachers would spring up, convincing people to believe messages which did not have their origin in God. They will encounter some of these false doctrines. So some of these false prophets were tricky, and they were deceptive and not easy to spot. We can see an example in 2 Corinthians 11:13-14. For such men are false prophets, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. So verse 12, and because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. The King James says, and because iniquity shall abound. So as we see our country, decline, we can look back to this Jewish part of time, and try to not let our love grow cold for the world, and try to reach out to as many people as we can and tell them the good news of Jesus. But it is hard for us to stay warm. But we need to surround ourselves with Christians, and it's easier to act like Christians when we can be, around Christians. But as the community around us changes and old Christian friends surrender to the world, it is sometimes harder to preserve. It's easy to join the crowd, and it would have been easy to relinquish their convictions about Christ and avoid the pain and persecution of enemies and backstabbers. So the apostles had been commanded to love their enemies, turn the cheek, and go to the second mile. And Jesus was describing for them a time when this was really going to hit them, when this really, meant that they would be under tribulation and trials, that they had to really work on this to keep their hearts warm. Jesus' promises that if people he is talking to in this chapter, along with us, are able to endure, we can be saved and be with him in heaven. Okay, so verse 14. Yeah, go ahead.
At this time, there was a lot going on. You got the transition from the Jews to Christianity, and then now you've got Roman persecution at the time also. So they were facing several types of persecution at that time, and then the fact that they're staying faithful, and it even says that and kill you. That they're even during this time that we saw the Christians being killed with the Romans, but it's important like we're talking about that specific time it's a transition from the old law to the new law, and they're fighting that, and then you've got persecution from the Roman government at the same time. So it's really a
Yep.
challenging time for them.
Yep. And we're going to get into that a little more here on Romans, on what's going on in Jerusalem during this time. So verse 14. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So during this time, the good news about the salvation brought by Jesus would be taken across the world and preached to all kinds of people. Remember that the gospel has not yet been given to the Gentiles. So the apostles probably thought that this was the Jewish gospel or the Jewish good news. They could have thought that. Notice the gospel of the kingdom would go to all nations before the temple was destroyed. We first see that the gospel is spread to the Gentiles at Cornelius' house in Acts chapter 10. The apostles doesn't seem like, I don't know if they grasped this whole thing, but they would they would be shown it by the Holy Spirit, and God desired the good news to go to the Gentiles as well as the Jews. So in verse 15, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. So I'm sure there's been many books and many debates and many, we could stand right here and talk about the abomination of desolation and come up with all kinds of wild, not us, but the world has, and other religious people have, there's all kinds of crazy ideas of what the abomination of desolation. I'm not saying it's easy, it's not what I'm saying, but it's a lot of information, that we can talk about there. So I'm kind of just going to briefly talk about a few things. So Jesus doesn't come up with this abomination of desolation. The apostles should have known or would have known that, and he also says it. It comes from the book of Daniel. So it's Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, 11, verse 31, and 12, verse 11, where we see the abomination of desolation. Yes.
In that, talking about the gospel being preached to all the world, in Colossians chapter 1, verse 23, Paul says, if you continue in the faith grounded and settled, be not removed away from the hope of the gospel which you have heard, and which was preached to every creature which is under heaven, wherefore I, Paul, am made a minister. So there was a fulfillment of that
Right.
the gospel would go to all
All the
nations.
nations. Yep.
That's, Jesus talked about it, and that's going to be, this is like AD 33, and the temple was going to be destroyed in AD 70.
Yep.
So all these things he talked about would happen. This is one of the fulfillments that we can see
Okay.
where the gospel was preached.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. So there's some views that the abomination of desolation is a specific term referring to only one event, time in history. I don't think that what I've studied in preparing for this class, I don't think that is the case. I think that Daniel 9:27 is speaking of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and then the reference in Daniel 11:31, it appears to be referencing the disrespect of the temple by Epiphanes. That would have happened before Christ, around between like 170 and 200 BC. So this can be understood through a study of Daniel, which I'm not qualified to teach that class at all, but it's there's a lot there, but there's a lot of prophecy that we can see that's fulfilled by Christ. That's kind of what's so interesting, and it strengthens my faith, is all these little pieces and parts that we find through the Old Testament. They all come fulfilled, in the New Testament. And it's you can see that God is taking care of us through the whole age to be able to have strong faith in the Bible and what He wants us to do. If you turn over to Luke 21, verse 20. So that says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near." So Luke kind of uses the same wording, but he's speaking to probably writing more to a Gentile audience. Matthew would have been writing, directly to Jews. So the Hebrew term for abomination was used many times in the Old Testament. It was most often to refer to idolatry, pagan worship, and immorality. Desolation, the desolation foretold by Jesus will come at the hands of the wicked and abominable men. So the destruction of the city and the temple in 70 AD would absolutely be classified as desolation. So if you have time, sometime you want to look at I'm going to kind of briefly talk about the Roman siege, but there's writings, there's all kinds of historical records, talking about the destruction of the temple. So when they saw the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, they were to take action. So what do you think, the holy place? What is that? That's probably a reference to the Jerusalem and the temple. And then at the time this was spoken by, the apostles certainly would have thought that Jerusalem, was a holy place. And Jerusalem contained the holiest of all places, which would have been the temple. So we're going to see kind of what, after this verse, we're going to see what the apostles were supposed to do when they started to see the armies gathering around the city. So verse 16 through 19. "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is in the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for a woman who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days." I'm going to read down to 22. "Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." So again, our context is important to this. So this is talking about the days before the destruction of the temple. But I think there is some application for us here. The siege of Jerusalem was not a spur-of-the-moment siege on a singular city of the Jews. The Jews had staged a rebellion in Judea. And then this is kind of the history behind. I'm going to briefly discuss this. So there was some factions in Jerusalem that were already fighting with each other. And then the Roman armies started to arrive at Jerusalem, and they were led by Vespasian. He was a general. but he was also in line to become Caesar. So Vespasian finally arrived at Jerusalem and was preparing a war around Jerusalem. We can read a lot of this, and like I mentioned, in in Josephus. So Nero died, he was the Caesar. So Vespasian pulled back before he totally overtook Jerusalem. They were making war, but they were kind of just not going for full destruction. So when Vespasian pulled out, there was already wars going on in Jerusalem. And so when the Romans left, it created who was going to be in power among the Jews. So there was 2 or 3 groups of Jews that were fighting. And then Vespasian sends his son Titus to kind of finish up the job. So Vespasian is in Alexandria, making sure that his power, so he sends Titus. And Titus he kind of had a hard time beating the Jews that were already fighting there. So he built a wall around the city and was starving the people, the Jews, out of the city. But we think, some of the Christians, they started to see the Romans or surround the city. There were times that the people that knew what Jesus had said, the Christians, had time to escape. And we know by history that some Christians escaped. We don't know if it's during Vespasian's time or if it's during Titus's time. But some of those people do escape. But there's probably over roughly a million people killed during this 2 to 3 year period of this raging war. And I want to talk about those 2 or 3 factions of people, of Jews that were in the city. Some of them set up camp inside the temple, which was not a place where what they should have been doing. They used that as a base. So I'm simplifying all this history here, but there's a lot to be learned, and how these people were lived their life. So Titus was willing to spare the city from absolute destruction, but some of the Jews would not surrender. The Jews put up a good fight, but Titus had his tactics. Like we said, he was going to basically starve these people. So in Josephus talks about, this is kind of what's going on in Jerusalem at this time. So when Titus, in going his rounds along those valleys, saw them full of dead bodies and the thick putrefaction running about them, he gave a groan, and spreading out his hands to heaven, called God to witness that this was not his doing. So eventually, the walls were breached by the Romans. The city was leveled. Josephus records that Titus told his men not to destroy the temple, but his command was forgotten in the heart of the battle, and the entire temple structure was brought to the ground. And I kind of read some history things about that. Inside the temple, what they used for like the grout lines was gold. So when the purpose of taking all the rocks and the stones off was to get that gold, and they melted it down and then sent it back to Vespasian in Alexandria. That was one reason that all the stones were turned over. All right, let's, so verse 16, and then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So when they see this, when they see the city surrounded, they were to flee the mountains, flee to the mountains. Verse 17, let the one who has the housetop not to go down and to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back his cloak. These verses aren't confusing in substance or in this context, but they can be confusing when reading them again in Luke 17, 31 to 33. Luke's texts appear to be talking about the second coming of Jesus, not the destruction of Jerusalem. So let's read that. Luke 17. On that day, let the one who is on the housetop with his goods in the house not come down to take them away, and likewise let the one who is in the field turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Whoever seeks to preserve his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will keep it.
What verse was that for?
Luke 17, 31 to 33. So I think that Jesus intends his audience to understand the principle behind the words rather than to take them literally. So I think this is about, these words are to be about preparedness. Jesus probably is not literally forbidding someone to return to their house or pick up their cloak. Instead, he's talking about being ready, in a constant state of readiness. Let's just think how we can apply that, to our lives. If Jesus would come back today, are we ready?
I think in the context, Cole, he's telling them, when you see this happen, you get out of the city as quick as you can.
Right.
Don't, because the armies have surrounded it, and if you don't, you're going to be destroyed. And he's talking to the Christians here, and for the elect's sake, and according to what Josephus said, now I know he's just a historian,
right,
but he said no Christians perished during this fall of Jerusalem.
Right.
They looked for the signs, and they were able to get out of the city.
Right. So let's talk about, like we're talking about birth pains, and a little farther down. So birth pains, there's a reason for birth pains, so you can prepare to be ready for the, it doesn't just. I've been through a few birth pains. I've witnessed a few birth pains.
News to me.
And it's not like as soon as those start happening, here's the baby, So there were signs, and they were to look for those so they could, save themselves.
But I think when he talks about the birth pains there, he's talking about woe to the woman with child, that because it would be hard for her to move.
Right.
Somebody that was close to giving birth, it would be difficult.
Right.
And so this is just a warning that they were to flee that city. They were to get out because the city was going to be destroyed.
Yep. Very good. Yep.
In Luke 17 compares when Lot, when he left Sodom.
Right.
It came.
Right. It was, in a hurry.
Yeah.
Right. So we think Luke 17 is more about the destruction of the earth.
Right.
Yep.
Well, he does, because if you go to verse 26, it's the same thing that Matthew says. In the days of Noah, they shall eat and drink and give marriage and give it in marriage, and this is going to come upon them very quickly. That's talking about the end of the world,
Right.
not the fall of Jerusalem.
Right. All right. Thank you. does anybody have any ideas on why he says, or the Sabbath day? What would be, how would those Jews relate to that, or the Christian Jews?
In Nehemiah 13:9, I just had a study on that.
Okay.
It wasn't because the Sabbath wasn't still holy, it was that at that time it had been made more difficult for them to escape because the gates of the city would have been locked.
Right.
According to Nehemiah, it just made it more difficult for them to escape.
Right. But the city doors would have been locked also. They were under siege too. That's kind of why I was kind of thinking about that. You're right, Tony. Like, it was for these Christian Jewish people, it would have been hard for them to escape the city. They would have taken all their household things on the Sabbath day when nobody's out and about, and they're trying to escape the city. So it would, if they were people trying to catch deserters or something like that, they would have stuck out like a sore thumb. So there's a small window of time for the Jews to escape the city of Jerusalem between the departure of Vespasian and the rise of the three warring factions inside of Jerusalem. So verse 21. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be. So the tribulation would come at the hands of the Romans and their fellow Jews. It's preparing for this class. I knew the Jews had persecution. I knew it was a terrible time, but I mean, people were just horrible to each other. This was in history, this was a sad time. So verse 22, and if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. So Jimmy kind of already talked about, about this, that those Christians that left the city. There was a lot of Christians that didn't. Josephus says no Christians died, but if the slaughter of the Romans had continued in Judea with the same intensity, it would have not taken long for the entire nation to be destroyed. In some way, God abbreviated the siege of Jerusalem and the rage of the Romans for the sake of the elect. Saved by the bell. All right, thank you.